The brief introduction to our keynote speaker, Professor Charles Hopkins. I think as you can see, there's a long list of the contributions that Professor Hopkins has made in the field. However, I think you can read it, but I will then ask you that I think it's very important for the leading experience that Professor Hopkins has made. Professor Charles Hopkins is currently the UNESCO chair at the York University in Toronto, Canada, where, as well as lecturing in the graduate program, he coordinated the international network of teacher education institutions from 15 countries, collaborate working on the reorientation of elementary and secondary teacher education to address sustainable development. And he has received many awards, highlighted by 2 honorary PhDs and several honorary professionalship fellowships, including the Royal Society of UK and the Baseball Seminar, Senior Advisory Position, Civic Medal, National Award, and the Silver Jubilee Medal from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And now he can add the International Belief and Value Institute, 2010 and 2011, the Sustainable Vision and the Values Award. Wow, that's great. I think that's far enough. Okay, I think the speech and Professor Hopkins is going to address is developing leaders to address the challenge of climate change adaptation. As shown in his slide, that 80% of the world leaders got a higher education degree. In Taiwan, I think our leaders, maybe 95, more than 95% got their PhD, their higher education degree. So I think the issue is very important. Okay, now let's welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Hopkins.
Thank you very much. The problem, as you get older, the introductions sound like an obituary in the newspaper. So, Mr. Chair and Vice President Chang, Ahmadishan Liu, and fellow speakers, and distinguished guests, my colleagues, and fellow endangered species. I'm very, very pleased to be here with you today. I have the nice, easy job as the first speaker, because I can talk about the broad perspective of things. And then it'll be up to the other speakers to actually give you the real, the specific information and so on. This is an extremely important topic, and I will come back to it again when we talk about the percentage of people who actually get to go to higher education. Taiwan is very, very unusual in the world, with so many people having access to higher education. But the question in the back of each of your minds as professors, is it enough to simply attend higher education? Does it matter what is the content of that higher education? That is the thing that we really do need to be questioning and quizzing as we go along. Now, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about education for sustainable development. Some of you may know, but I was part, there were 10 people in between 1987 and 1992 that drafted the document for the Earth Summit in Rio, Agenda 21. And in it, we called upon education, public awareness, and training systems to be a major help in trying to move from the goal of development to the new goal of sustainable development. How do we do that? And one of the means of implementation, there were 4 sections in Agenda 21. One of the sections was on means of implementation. Chapter 35, for instance, was on science. Chapter 36, education, public awareness, and training. And really what we talked about was engaging the world's education systems. We weren't talking about adding on sustainability education to an already crowded curriculum. We were talking about engaging the world's education systems from preschool to higher education and lifelong learning. We talked about not just engaging the formal education, we also talked about public awareness systems. And we talked about the world's training systems, where we do know how to operate everything from jet engines to sewage treatment plants, where we know how to do it better. We need to engage that as well. So we didn't talk about environmental education for sustainable development, or peace education, or science education. We talked about education itself in that broader aspect. The problem was that no one told ministers of education. It was fortunately the ministers of environment who stepped forward, and in those early years, it was largely environmental education that kept it alive. So there were 4 things that we talked about. One was this important one, access to quality education. At the time we were writing this, in the late 1980s, there were about 150 million children with no school. Now it's down to about 75 million. That's the number of children in Europe for whom there is no school whatsoever. So that's an important one. Access, but not just access, but also retention. Because we have around the world so many students who drop out. And then this is an important word too. What is a quality education? If we can envision the world our children will inherit, what are the knowledge, skills, values, perspectives, ethics, this conference? What will they need? The second one is understanding that it is our most educated countries that are leaving the deepest ecological footprints and creating some of the greatest threats to a sustainable future. So simply the education system that we now have is not the answer. And by exporting it through private universities and colleges to the developing world is not a help to a sustainable future. We need to rethink what is a quality higher education to make the change. The third one is this public awareness and understanding, and that's where other ministries, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries, Environment, etc., we need to have the general public, especially schools, hearing the same message. So it's not just something for the examination. This is for life's examination. And the fourth one, as I say, the training programs. Now, unfortunately, ministries of education, when they heard of it, they immediately thought, oh, sustainability education, how are we going to add that to this? I used to be the superintendent of curriculum for the Toronto Board of Education, and every week a group would come with their binder, and they say, please put this in the curriculum. And the teacher is saying, go. I'm working on mathematics and language. Go away. I have no time for that. So it is a problem for how do we even talk about sustainability and what we are talking about. So it's important that there is a difference between adding sustainability education to this. It's one approach. It's what many school systems are trying to do. But what we really wanted was the very purpose of education itself, the whole system. Now, the second thing then, what are the relationships between education for sustainable development and climate change, especially in higher education? Because there are many threats that are out there threatening a sustainable future. The millions of not only uneducated young people, but the millions who are educated for whom there is no work, or the people who are educated but they are not educated for the workforce. Now, I'm not saying that the purpose of education is to prepare people for the workforce. There's much more to education than that, but it is a component that we need to take into consideration. There are different views and different perspectives. When I come to Asia, everywhere I see the cranes. They used to be the peace cranes, right? The bird, the peace crane, and so on. Now it's the building crane, all over, everywhere. So different ways of looking at things. Is the building rising quickly, or is it the water level and climate change that is changing? Now, this is what I think you were referring to, is this statistic. In the last 15 years, higher education institutions have almost doubled. And we have gone from 1%. There are about 140,000. Checked it out this morning. Sorry. 17. Good job, I got it. 17,000 universities in the world and 135 million students. Now, when you work out average length of time in university and so on, we're now up to about 2% of the world's population gets to go to higher education. So you can see how different Taiwan is. Very, very different. But of those 2%, they will probably become 80% or more of the world's decision makers. They will be the ones who will control the politics, the private sector, faith-based groups, religions, and so on. They will be the ones. So if we are going to bring about change, an extremely crucial place to think about that is higher education. And yet it's higher education itself that determines what gets taught, what gets valued. So it is the role of higher education, the senates, and the teaching and the faculty to question themselves. They are the ones who will need to be rethinking this. Now, with climate change in particular, we've seen that there are two approaches. One is trying to reduce it, the mitigation, and the other is saying it's going to happen. For a while, we thought maybe it was preventable, but too little was done too late. So we're in for the change. Okay? So what then is the role of higher education in moving to this adaptation? Now, to date, we have put most of our research into the natural and physical sciences of climate change. We need to start looking at more at the social sciences. If we only spend our money here in understanding, the last person will die knowing exactly what the methane gas was doing. What we really need is to have the general public know and understand and start to move towards what you called upon, that this had to be a transformation of the values and ethics and what the general public accept as a good life, the purpose. So my talk now is going to be split sort of into these two, the adaptation and the mitigation. So the mitigation in the natural and the physical sciences, these are the things that we've been doing. We've been trying to better understand climate change. Is it real? Is it not? What are the causes of it? What is actually happening? And so on. And yet there is still great doubt about that, and I'll talk about it in a minute. We're changing manufacturing practice, the green economy. Right? Everyone is talking about a green economy. But we must go much deeper than a green economy. We need an ecological economy. If you simply green the economy by reducing your costs of energy and waste and water consumption, but you are still making plastic shopping bags. If you are still making products, chemicals and other products that are going to be harmful to the environment, that is a whole different thing. We need to understand what it is that we are making, and we must bring the values and ethics into it, and that's why I'm so happy about the discussion that you're starting here today. It's more than greening the production of the existing harmful things. We need to change our agricultural practices, and these are the kinds of things that we're doing. We're exploring the alternative energy, and we're doing more in trying to improve our monitoring and predicting. That's been very helpful. But in the mitigation approaches of the social sciences, this is where we need much more research in trying to understand what are the societal norms that we have inherited from previous generations as to what is important, what is status. How are we being shaped by the media? 50% of all of the world's advertising budget is spent on the United States. They are nowhere near, they are less than 1/3 of the world's purchasing power. But 50% of advertising is spent on the United States because of the media bounce of Hollywood, magazines, television shows, and so on that go out. Now that advertising budget is shifting, and it is not shifting to Europe. It is shifting to Asia. And so the need for media literacy and understanding what is being broadcast to and how your society is being shaped, etc., is important. And you mentioned consumption change and questioning our current societal goals. Now, if we look to the second part, the adaptation, again, we see many of the same things, but they must be much more severe, much more radical. As we see that with climate change, whole different crops will be grown, which means that farmers who have the machinery for one crop may no longer be able to grow that. And so we will have to come up with incentives and help for farmers to do it. Those kinds of practices. This whole thing about the greening of the economy is the first step is how do we maintain our GDP, our gross domestic product, but how do we make it more carbon-free? How do we remove? GDP itself is not necessarily bad, but what makes up our GDP, we need to question. If we build a $100 million yacht and operate it, it has an ecological footprint, and it contributes $100 million to GDP. A $100 million Van Gogh painting also brings $100 million to GDP, but the ecological footprint is a bit smaller than the yacht. Right? So it's how do we build our GDP that will be Earth-friendly? Then the big decisions here around land use, planning policy, the design of infrastructure, all of these things. So you see, every discipline, everyone who is sitting here, whether you're in the social sciences or the natural sciences or whatever, there is something about this in your particular discipline. The adaptation from the social sciences is also extremely, I think, important. And I just put some examples up here. But if you were to have a department meeting, if you're in sociology, or a department meeting in human geography, and so on, you can see where I'm coming, but you're going to supply the answers to these, right, the next speakers. But these whole concepts need discussion and fleshed out. And there are probably things that I have not yet begun to even think about that would be applicable in a Taiwan, Asian, global context. Now, this idea of well-being, you know, the Finns, the people in Finland have spent the last 6 or 7 years, their highest level of research, it's called SITRA, S-I-T-R-A. They are really looking into the concept of well-being. And I'm leaving this slide with you, but the idea that well-being and happiness is not just dependent on income and wealth. No, it's dependent on many other things. Meaningfulness in one's life, your ability to serve other people, to be a part, to make sense of your life. Who am I? What am I doing? Etc. As well as your basic Maslowian needs. And then your relationships with other people, the many different roles that you play. So all of this is part of understanding what is the individual's well-being. Now we are looking at higher education and the kindergarten through grade 12 secondary school education system. How can education help to move from individual well-being to societal well-being, the well-being of all Taiwanese, of all Finns? And then when we get going, we realize that this cannot be limited to humans. If we are going to look at, and that's where Confucius, Buddhist, and other sort of Eastern thoughts need to come in. This cannot just be for humans. So what we are looking at is to say everyone has something to contribute. This is not just for environmental educators. It is not just for mathematicians. It's not. What we're saying is that no one group can own this all. This is something that all of us need to do. And that every discipline, every group, every teacher has something to bring together. But what is needed is the leadership. Who brings these people together? A gathering like this today, how do we begin this conversation? So it's so important. And because it's not as though this is about training. In a way it is, but more it's about learning. It's about sharing. It's about discussing. So the old idea of train the trainers, you know, tell one, one tells two, two tells four, it's great for sales, but it's not good for learning. We need those continuous feedback loops. And the people who are sitting in the back row probably have every bit as great an insight as the people sitting in front rows. How do we get these kinds of discussions moving forward? And in particular, I'm so pleased that the meeting for these 2 days is addressing the need for leaders. One of the great shortages around the world is this whole idea of leaders coming forward, because most leaders do not understand it. Most of the leaders of the education systems don't understand, and they do not want to be made a fool of. They don't want to stand up and say, I don't know about this. It takes a great deal of courage as a leader to say, I need your help. We need to learn together. And that's where we need to be moving. And so we need the work of how do we engage our own professional organizations? How do we engage the world's unions? They have already come forward and say sustainability is crucial. But how can management work with unions together when traditionally our mindset is that, you know, we are opposed? And how do we move forward with the legal and regulating bodies? If we have time, you know, later over tea, I'm working with the Supreme Court in Peru over what does this mean for Supreme Court judgments? If we move from simply environmental regulation and economic discussions that are largely led by the corporations, who will talk about the social, you know, the indigenous people who are displaced? Does the money that comes for the gold and the oil and natural gas, where does it go? Does it go to that region? And so on. So these are things that everything has to be engaged, because it really is going to take, as you pointed out, Dr. Liu, the idea of moving forward is building the political will to do it. We often think, well, our political leaders should do it. Political leaders don't lead. Political leaders follow. Political leaders know where they can get the support. If they are not getting the support from the general public, they're not going to go there. The #1 goal of most politicians in the world is not good governance. The #1 goal, staying in power. So it comes back then to, we have to work with society in general and get society to push the politicians and the politicians to listen to the right people. And this is another whole mechanism that we have to explore and know and understand, and that means the social sciences must also be engaged. This idea of a knowledgeable consumer is extremely important, because most people are trained around the world to look at one thing: what does it cost? And unfortunately, there are so many poor people in the world who are forced, because of their economic situation, they can only buy the cheapest. So those who can make a choice, it is extremely important that those of us who can make a choice because of our economic situation, that we make a wise choice, and we understand that the advertising may not be true at all. So we need to, yeah, I think that is enough. And I have 2 minutes left. So and I will set the tone as the first speaker. So thank you very, very much, and I look forward to listening to others and to being with you over these next 2 days. Thank you very much.